And his predictions and tracking have been very, very accurate, and that's why we bring you the financial experts who actually have a proven track record, not the ones that were telling us everything was going to be great 2 years ago when they knew full well we were going into a recession/depression. He's been on the news lately talking about the next 2, 5, 10 years, not sure when, the real specter of hyperinflation, what that means. It doesn't have to be Zimbabwean or Weimar Republic level to be devastating, so I wanted to get him on to talk about that. Also, his prognosis for the dollar, because we've got people like Harry Schultz, who's a highly respected and been pretty accurate in the past. Also, Bob Chapman has confirmed from embassy people he knows that they are telling embassies, dump your dollars, hoard foreign currencies for September. Now, is that just some drill, or is that an ominous sign of global dumping of the dollar? Who knows? We'll ask him about that and a lot more in the next 20 minutes. Mr. Faber, thank you for coming on with us.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, you got the floor. Tell us about the specter of hyperinflation, what you see happening in the world economy. Is there going to be a recovery, or is this just the beginning?
Well, basically, the U.S. economy went into recession in October, November 2007. But initially, because the government manages to massage figures, it didn't show up right away. But after September 2008, the global economy fell off a cliff, and we probably kind of bottomed out in March, April, but it doesn't mean that we will have a strong recovery. I think if you look at the cycle 2001, when the recovery began, to 2007, we reached a peak prosperity sometimes in 2006, early 2007 in the world, and we're not going to go back there anytime soon. The problem I have with inflation is this. The government's reaction to the crisis has been essentially to slash interest rates to zero. In other words, the very policies that created the crisis post-2001, when the Fed slashed the Fed fund rate from 6.5% down to 1% and kept the Fed fund rate at 1% until June 2004, when actually the recovery had begun in November 2001. That led to the housing bubble, to the credit bubble, and to the problems that we are facing today. So the same policies are now applied, zero interest rate, which of course robs essentially the savers of any income on their deposits with banks and in treasury bills. And at the same time, this time around, we have this huge expansion in the fiscal deficit, in the budget deficit of the U.S. government. And the projections, who knows what they will be eventually, but I'm sure this year the fiscal deficit will be in the order of $2 trillion. Now, the government is forecasting that it will come down next year, but I'm not sure about that. Now, when you combine large fiscal deficits with expansionary monetary policies, it is very likely that at some point inflation will be relatively high. Once inflation is relatively high and the economy doesn't recover, then the government will print even more money, and that will then accelerate the level of inflation rate.
Now, over the decades tracking this, sir, and being on the boards of scores of countries internationally looking at this, what's the inside scoop, if any, on what the private Federal Reserve is really planning, what the central banks in Europe are planning? I mean, they're openly announcing all this new power to regulate themselves, to grab whole areas of the economy. Obama's firing heads of GM and hacking it up in pieces and handing it out to cronies. I mean, it's getting really serious.
Well, I mean, basically, we had two systems until the end of the 1970s in the world, essentially free market capitalism, the market economy, and the planning economy. And as you know, under communism, socialism, central planners totally failed with their policies to create sustainable economic growth. And if you traveled to Russia in 1980 or to China in 1980, these countries were really impoverished. And the U.S., in particular, today is moving towards an interventionist policy of the government moving into the economy and trying to fix the economy left, right, and center. In the extreme case, you would go essentially to the planning economy. Well, it's not going to happen right away. But basically, the more the government has an influence in the economy and intervenes in the economy, and I have to stress that the current crisis is not a failure of free market. It's a failure of government intervention. One of the big interventions was obviously Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which essentially had cheaper access to funds than the banking system. And these were the big bankruptcies in America in terms of size. And also other regulatory intervention into the money market, into the price of money by the Federal Reserve post-2001, also, as I just mentioned, created a problem. So it's not that the free market has failed, it's the interventions by the government that failed. And now these failed policies are even enlarged, and that is where I have a problem with the current economic policymakers.
Well, yes, sir. I mean, I'm no economist, but it's just common sense watching the markets, following how this works. You have these elite banks, elite brokerage firms, elite power structures who want the planned economy, as Carol Quigley wrote in Tragedy and Hope. They actually are what I'd call crony capitalists, monopoly capitalists. They're not free market. They're actually using government regulators to force the sale of banks, brokerage firms, credit unions, infrastructure to them. And they are being engorged, being rewarded for the crisis they created, and now vertically integrating everything. And now they've made the crisis even worse since the banker takeover in October of last year in Europe and the U.S. And now they're, I'm sure you've seen the new, quote, federal, redo where they're claiming they're going to have new regulations. But when you read it, it just says absolute power of the Federal Reserve to do whatever it wants to take over any industries. I mean, again, where do you see this ending? Just with one global bank ruling everything, this new bank of the world that we're going to pay our carbon taxes to?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to see where it will end. But as I pointed out, I think it will end with much more inflation. And there is a big misconception in the world, which is that when the economy is weak, there are no inflationary pressures. Usually, when you have a strong economy, you have low inflation. And when you have weak economy, you have high inflation because of the government's interventions in the economy through fiscal measures, fiscal deficits, and through expansionary monetary policies. Basically, you can have huge excess capacities and high inflation. The two have nothing at all to do with each other.
Well, would you call
this...
I
think we will have high inflation, and at the same time, I think what we will eventually have is some kind of social unrest, because I can't believe that people will be fooled forever by what you call crony capitalism.
Yes, sir. And I want to speak more on that, but that begs the question, how long can this go on with this crony capitalism or monopoly capitalism?
Well, it can go on for quite some time and, make things much worse. But my view would be that within the next 5 to 10 years, when the public realizes that the economy does not improve and possibly, in my opinion, actually deteriorate, and it is faced with actually higher taxes, which may not be obvious, but they will happen because of the large deficit, then at that stage I think there will be, a social revolution or some kind of social revolution, or the next thing the government will do to distract the attention of the people on bad economic conditions, they'll start the war somewhere.
Ah, very well said. That's what they normally do, and it looks like with North Korea and Iran, they could be steaming towards that goal. Would you call the most likely outcome a type of hyper-stagflation where the real economy's dying, but they flood the world with these worthless notes and credit, And so we're going to have a continual stagnation like Japan, or will it accelerate towards a black hole with an overlay of inflation? And how bad will that inflation be? I mean, will it approach Zimbabwe or Weimar, or will it be 20-30% a year?
Well, I tell you, it doesn't really matter whether inflation is 10-15% a year or whether it's the Zimbabwe style of inflation. Because if you go up to 10% inflation a year, it's likely that you will then go to 15%. And if you're at 15%, it's likely you go to 20%, and so forth. It's once it's the inflation magic is let out of the bottle, it usually accelerates and expands. So I think the likelihood that we will have eventually high inflation rates in the U.S. are very high.